The gun was pressed against John Merritt's temple before Susan Shelton even had a chance to scream. She stood frozen in the doorway of the Dusty Creek Saloon, her travel-worn dress still coated in the red dust of the Arizona Territory, her heart hammering so violently against her ribs that she could feel it in her throat. The man holding the gun was her brother, Clarence Shelton, and his eyes were wild with the particular madness of someone who had been nursing a secret for far too long. "You told him," Clarence snarled, not at John but at her. "You told this drifter everything." Clarence put the gun down. Her voice was steadier than she felt. That was a skill she had learned early, growing up on the Shelton Ranch in Tucson, where showing fear was the same as inviting more of it. John Merritt did not flinch. That was the thing about him that she had noticed the very first day he rode onto their land 6 weeks ago that seemed like a lifetime now. He did not flinch. He stood completely still, broad-shouldered and calm, his dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the barrel of the gun, like a man who had already made peace with whatever the next few seconds held. "The lady didn't tell me a thing," John said, his voice low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had grown up understanding that panic was a luxury no one could afford. "I figured it out myself." Clarence's grip tightened. The hammer clicked back. "Then you're both dead," Clarence said. And in that single, suspended, crystalline moment, Susan Shelton understood with absolute clarity that the past 6 weeks had been the most important weeks of her entire life, that every secret she had kept, every choice she had made, every terrifying night she had spent wondering if tomorrow would be the day everything collapsed, had led to this exact point. And she understood something else, something that flooded her chest with a warmth that was almost ridiculous given the circumstances. She was in love with John Merritt. Completely, irreversibly, desperately in love with him. And she could not let her brother pull that trigger. 6 weeks earlier, the Arizona Territory had been baking under a July sun so ferocious it turned the horizon into a shimmer of false water. The year was 1882, and Dusty Creek was the kind of town that had grown too fast and governed itself too loosely, a collection of timber-framed storefronts, a single church without a permanent preacher, 3 saloons, a telegraph office, and a sheriff who spent more time drunk than sober. The Shelton Ranch sat 7 miles outside of town, 3,000 acres of scrub and cattle that Susan's father, Elias Shelton, had carved out of the desert over 30 years. Elias Shelton was dying. That was the secret that sat at the center of everything, the dark, hidden truth that Susan had been living with for 4 months. A wasting illness, the doctor in Tucson had called it, refusing to attach a more specific name to the thing eating her father from the inside. Elias had perhaps 3 months remaining, perhaps 4. The ranch would pass to his children, to Susan and Clarence. The problem was Clarence. Susan had known for years that her brother was not what he appeared to be. To the town, to the ranch hands, even to their father, Clarence Shelton was charming, capable, and devoted. He managed the cattle drives. He negotiated with the buyers from the railroad companies who were moving through Arizona Territory with increasing frequency, their surveyors and their lawyers and their hungry eyes always measuring the land for what it might become. Clarence smiled at all the right moments and shook all the right hands, but Susan had seen what no one else had seen. She had seen the ledger books that did not balance. She had found the letters hidden beneath the false bottom of Clarence's writing desk, letters from a man named Harlan Voss, who represented the Southwestern Land and Cattle Consortium, a company that had been quietly swallowing ranches across the territory for 2 years. And she had overheard, on a suffocating night in late March, the conversation between her brother and Harlan Voss himself, conducted in low voices on the back porch while their father slept fitfully inside. Clarence had agreed to sell the Shelton Ranch to the consortium. He had accepted a down payment. He planned to do it before their father died, using a power of attorney document that Susan was almost certain had been forged. The consortium wanted the land not for cattle, but for the railroad right-of-way that the surveyors had already quietly mapped through the eastern edge of the property. Clarence would receive $50,000. The ranch hands would be turned out. The land would be stripped of everything it had been. And their father would die not knowing that the 30 years of his life's work had been sold beneath him. Susan had spent weeks trying to determine what to do. She could not go to the sheriff, who was Voss's drinking companion and very likely on the consortium's payroll. She could not go to a lawyer in Tucson without Clarence finding out before anything could be done. She needed help, and she needed it from someone who had no connection to Dusty Creek, no obligation to Clarence or Voss, and no reason to lie to her. What she had not expected was for that help to arrive on horseback, unannounced, on a hot Tuesday morning in the first week of July. John Merritt had ridden in from the east, from New Mexico Territory, following the work the way drifting ranch hands did in those years. He was 28 years old, with dark hair that wanted to curl at the edges of his hat brim, and the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of outdoor labor rather than the gym that did not yet exist. His horse was a good one, a bay quarter horse named Calico on account of the irregular patches of darker color along its flanks, and the gear he carried was minimal but well-maintained, which told Susan something useful about his character when she watched him ride in through the gate. He asked to speak to the foreman about work. The foreman, an old man named Pete Garza who had been on the Shelton ranch since before Susan was born, brought him to the house. Susan answered the door because her father was resting and Clarence was in town. She remembered looking at him and feeling something shift in her chest, something she could not quite name. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that the illustrated magazines from back east defined handsome. His face was angular and a little too serious, his jaw strong, his eyes so dark brown they were nearly black. But there was something in the way he stood, easy and unhurried but completely present, that made her feel as though he was actually looking at her, not through her or past her the way most men did with a woman they categorized quickly as rancher's daughter, available or unavailable, asset or obstacle. "John Merritt," he said, and offered his hand as naturally as if she were a business associate. Not many men did that with women in 1882. She shook it. "Susan Shelton. I heard you might be short-handed." A man in Benson said the Shelton spread was a decent outfit looking for experienced help. "We're always short-handed in summer," she said, and then, without quite planning to, she added, "Can you keep your own counsel?" He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I can." She hired him that afternoon over Pete Garza's mild skepticism and her own better judgment, which was telling her that bringing a stranger into a situation this volatile was either the smartest thing she had ever done or the most dangerous. The first week she watched him. She could not help it. She found reasons to be in the barn, in the corral, in the eastern pastures where he was working with 2 other hands to mend the fencing that the summer storms had damaged. He was a good worker, efficient and knowledgeable, and the other hands accepted him quickly, which meant something. Ranch hands in the Arizona Territory were suspicious of strangers on principle. If they accepted you, you had earned it. But she was not watching him because of his work ethic, though she told herself that was the reason. She watched him because she was trying to determine whether he was trustworthy, whether he was the kind of man she could tell the truth to. She had been carrying Clarence's secret for 4 months, and the weight of it had become so crushing that some days she could barely eat. She needed to tell someone. She needed an ally who would not betray her. On the 8th day, they ended up alone at the fence line at the eastern edge of the property, both having ridden out separately and arrived at the same broken section of post and wire at the same time. The sun was going down, painting the desert in shades of copper and deep rose, and they worked side by side for an hour without saying much, which was its own kind of conversation. "You ride the fence line yourself," he observed, when they had gotten the last wire secured. "Someone has to know the land," she said. "Most ranchers' daughters don't bother. My father taught me," she said. "He said the land doesn't care who it belongs to. It only responds to attention. John looked out at the desert for a moment, the last of the sun catching the angles of his face. Your father sounds like a man worth knowing. He's the best man I've ever known. Her voice caught slightly, and she pressed her lips together. She would not cry in front of a hired hand she had known for 8 days. He did not press her on it. He just gathered the tools and loaded them onto his saddle. But when he looked at her before mounting up, she saw in his expression something that she recognized because she had felt it herself, the look of someone who understood loss that had not finished happening yet. She did not tell him anything that evening, but she thought about telling him the entire ride back to the ranch house. It was the middle of the second week when everything accelerated. Harlan Voss arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, driving a smart buckboard with 2 men riding behind him who were dressed like hands but carried themselves like hired muscle. Susan watched from the upstairs window of the ranch house as Voss went inside to speak with Clarence, and she watched John Merritt in the yard below, who was watching Voss's men with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read warning signs. That evening she found him in the barn, checking Calico's feet, and she made the decision. She told him everything. She told him about the forged power of attorney, about the letters from the consortium, about the conversation she had overheard, about her father sleeping in the next room with 3 months left to live. Her voice was flat and controlled for most of it because if she allowed herself to feel it fully she would not be able to finish, and she needed to finish. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. The lantern light moved against the walls. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. She stared at him. Most men, she suspected, would have launched immediately into what they thought should be done, bypassing the question of what she wanted entirely. "I want to stop the sale. Legally, if possible. I want my father to die knowing his ranch is safe. I want Clarence to face consequences for what he's done, but not here, not in Dusty Creek, where Voss has too many people in his pocket." "The power of attorney document," John said. "If it's forged, there's a county recorder in Tucson who would have copies of your father's legal signatures on file. Those could be compared. A territorial judge, not a local one, could invalidate the document." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" A pause. "I used to study law." "Used to." Another pause, longer this time. "That's a longer story for another time." She accepted that. She had no leverage to demand more, and he had just given her the first genuinely useful information she had received in 4 months. The problem is getting to Tucson without Clarence knowing, and getting back before Voss files whatever he's planning to file. "When's the next scheduled meeting between your brother and Voss?" Voss mentioned Friday to Clarence. "I heard through the parlor window." "Today is Wednesday," John said. "We have 2 days." It was the "we" that did something to her. She registered it, held it for a moment, then set it aside because there was too much else to think about. They went to Tucson the next day, Susan telling Clarence she was going to visit Mrs. Hargrove, the wife of one of her father's oldest friends, which was true enough that she could maintain it under questioning. John rode into town separately, and they met at the Stage Road Junction 2 miles south of the ranch gate. The ride to Tucson took the better part of the day. It was too hot and too long, and the road was rough in places from the summer rains. And it was, despite everything, one of the most unexpectedly pleasant days Susan had spent in months. There was something freeing about being in motion, about having a plan and a direction, and John Merritt was easy to travel with. He was not talkative in a compulsive way, the way that some people filled silence because they were afraid of it. He spoke when there was something worth saying and was quiet when there wasn't, and in between they developed the rhythm of 2 people learning each other's pace. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn them about someone on a long ride where stopping and starting and the boredom of the open desert made conversation natural. He had grown up in Virginia. His father had been a lawyer and had wanted his son to follow him into the profession. John had studied law in Richmond for 2 years. Then the circumstances of his family had changed in ways he was still clearly not comfortable discussing, and he had come west. He had been moving ever since, working cattle and horses, staying nowhere for more than a season. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Studying law. I miss the order of it," he said after a moment. "The idea that there are rules and that the rules apply to everyone. That's not exactly how it works in practice." "No," he agreed, "but the idea of it is still worth something." She thought about that for a mile or so. "What made you stop?" He was quiet so long that she thought he was not going to answer. Then, "My father was accused of something he didn't do. A business dispute that became a criminal matter. The law I was studying didn't save him. It destroyed him." He said it simply, without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. "He died in prison when I was 23. I couldn't sit in a classroom after that and learn rules about fairness." She understood then why he had looked at her the way he had when she mentioned her father, and she felt something open in her chest that was a little dangerous in its softness. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 5 years ago," he said, which was not the same as saying he had recovered. In Tucson, they found the county recorder's office and a territorial circuit judge's representative who was in the city for the week. The comparison of documents was arranged with quiet efficiency, and the legal process that John explained to her in careful terms was set in motion. It would take time to fully invalidate the power of attorney document, but the judge's representative was willing to issue a temporary injunction blocking any property transfer pending investigation, provided the evidence of forgery held up. They rode back toward Dusty Creek as the late afternoon dissolved into evening, the sky above the Sonoran Desert turning colors that had no proper names, purple and copper and a bruised, beautiful blue. Susan was tired in her bones but lighter than she had felt in months. "Thank you," she said, when they were close enough to the junction where they would separate and ride back to the ranch by different routes, to avoid anyone noticing they had traveled together. John looked at her. The fading light did something complicated to his expression. "You don't need to thank me. You put this together yourself. I just knew where the courthouse was." "You knew a great deal more than that," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in the air between them, something that was not quite spoken and not quite unspoken. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned Calico toward the eastern approach to the ranch, and Susan turned her own horse toward the road from town, and they parted in the gentle blue dusk of the desert evening. She thought about him all night. Not in the abstract, useful way she had been thinking about him, as an ally, as a resource, as an unexpected piece of good luck in a bad situation. She thought about the line of his jaw in the lantern light of the barn when she had first told him everything. She thought about the way he had said, "we," without hesitation. She thought about his father in prison and his unfinished law degree and the 5 years of moving that had eventually brought him to a fence line in the eastern pasture of her father's ranch at exactly the moment she needed someone she could trust. She told herself firmly that none of this was appropriate. She was managing a crisis. Her father was dying. Her brother was a criminal. This was absolutely not the time. She thought about him anyway. The next morning, Friday, Harlan Voss arrived at the ranch in his buckboard. Clarence met him on the porch with the particular ease of a man who thought he was in control of everything. Susan watched from the parlor window and felt the telegraph she had sent from Tucson the previous afternoon working somewhere in the background, the machinery of the law moving in directions that Voss could not yet see. She had also, that morning, gone to her father's room. Elias Shelton was propped against his pillows, pale and thin in ways that broke her heart every time she saw them, but his eyes were still sharp and present. He was 61 years old and looked, in these last months, both older and somehow more essentially himself than he ever had, as though the illness was stripping away everything that wasn't fundamental. She almost told him. She stood by his bed and held his hand and almost told him everything. But she looked at the exhaustion in his face and thought about what knowing would do to him, and she decided instead to wait until the injunction was confirmed, until she had something solid to show him, until the danger was contained. "You look worried," her father said, studying her with the attention of a man who had known her for 25 years. "I'm always worried," she said and made herself smile. "I'm a worrier." "You're like your mother," he said. "She worried about everything and managed everything. It's not two different skills, it's the same skill." She kissed his forehead and left before he could see her eyes filling. Outside in the yard, John was repairing harness equipment near the water trough, close enough to the house to watch the buckboard without being obvious about it. As she came out the front door, he glanced at her, just briefly, a glance that asked a question without words. She gave a small nod. The injunction was in progress. He returned to the harness with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, the carefully neutral face that was his version of relief. The trouble came the following week, when Clarence discovered that someone had been in contact with a territorial judge. He did not know immediately who had done it, but he knew enough to know that his arrangement with Voss was in jeopardy, and the person in his household with both the knowledge and the motivation to interfere was his sister. He confronted her in the kitchen on a Monday evening. He was controlled about it, which was more frightening than anger would have been. Clarence Shelton had always been controlled. It was the thing about him that she had never quite trusted, even as a child. Real people lost their tempers sometimes. They got flustered. They showed their edges. Clarence never did, which meant his edges were hidden somewhere she could not see them. "I want to know what you've done," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway in his good suit, his hat in his hands. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Someone contacted Judge Patterson's office in Tucson about a property dispute on this ranch. The only property dispute on this ranch is one that you would have had to invent, or one that already existed and needed to be addressed," she said. His eyes were steady and cold. "You don't know what you've interfered with, Susan." "I think I know exactly what I've interfered with," she said. "I think I know about the power of attorney document and about Harlan Voss and about the $50,000 and about what Father's land is really worth to the railroad." The silence between them lasted a very long time. "You could have talked to me," Clarence said finally, and something in his voice shifted just enough to sound almost like the brother she had once believed he was. "You could have talked to Father," she said, "before you signed his land away without his knowledge." He put his hat back on. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize. Then he left. She stood in the kitchen for several minutes, her hands braced on the counter, her knees not entirely steady. She had just declared war on her brother in his own house. She had no idea what came next. What came next was that Clarence hired 2 more men who were not ranch hands. John noticed them first. He came to her in the garden the following morning, ostensibly to ask about a broken hinge on the equipment shed that needed ordering from town. But the real message was delivered quietly, while they both appeared to be discussing hardware. "2 men rode in last night after dark," he said, keeping his voice low and his eyes on the garden stakes he was helping her straighten as though that were the real task. "They're sleeping in the bunkhouse, but they're not looking for work. They carry their revolvers cross-draw, which is a fighting style, not a working style. Voss sent them." She absorbed this. "Clarence is going to try to move faster, before the injunction is finalized." "That's what I'm thinking," John said. "How long before the injunction is confirmed?" The circuit judge's representative said a week from the Tucson filing. "We're 4 days in. 3 more days." She needed to keep everything calm and moving normally for 3 more days. "All right," she said. "We keep to routine. Nothing looks different." He looked at her then directly with the full weight of those dark eyes, and she felt it in places she was genuinely trying to ignore. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was so simple and so direct that it nearly undid her, because no one had thought to ask her that in months. Everyone around her had their own stakes in what was happening. Pete Garza was loyal to the ranch but elderly and not equipped for this kind of trouble. Her father was ill. Clarence was her opponent. There had not been anyone whose primary concern was whether she, Susan Shelton, was all right. "Not entirely," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in weeks. He nodded as though that were the expected answer, and he respected her for giving it. 3 days, he said. "You can hold for 3 days." She believed him. She was not sure she should have, given that he was a man she had known for 2 weeks, but she believed him. 2 days later, everything fell apart. Clarence found the letters she had taken from his writing desk. She had made copies in Tucson, careful pencil copies of the most damning correspondences, which were what she had given to the judge's representative. But the originals had been in her room, tucked inside the spine of a Bible, and Clarence, who knew her better than she wanted to admit, had found them. He came to her room in the early morning before dawn, when the ranch was still, and the desert outside was that absolute, velvet quiet that preceded the birds. He had the letters in his hand, and his expression was the one she had never seen on him before, stripped down to something raw and genuinely frightened, which was far more dangerous than his usual control. "These are gone," he said. "From my desk, you took them." "I made copies," she said. "The copies are already with a territorial judge." "Susan," his voice broke slightly on her name, "you don't understand what I owe these people. Voss doesn't just want the land, there are debts. There are arrangements that go back 2 years. If this sale doesn't go through, if these men don't get what they've been promised, they will not simply walk away." She felt something cold move through her. "What kind of debts?" "The kind that don't get paid with money," he said. He was genuinely afraid. She could see it now, under the controlled exterior. Her brother was not a simple villain. He was a man who had made a catastrophic mistake 2 years ago and had been making progressively worse decisions ever since, trying to manage the consequences of the first one. That did not make what he was doing acceptable, but it complicated things in ways that made her chest ache. "Clarence," she said, "if you come to the judge with me voluntarily, if you provide information about Voss and the consortium, there may be a way through this that doesn't destroy you. Voss is the bigger crime. You could be a witness instead of a defendant." He looked at her for a long moment. She thought for a fraction of a second that she was reaching him. Then Voss's man knocked on her door. He did not knock politely. He tried the handle, and when it was locked, he hit the door with enough force that the frame splintered slightly. "Shelton," he said, meaning Clarence. "Voss needs you. Now." Clarence's expression closed back over itself like water closing over a stone. He was gone, the brother who had almost listened to her, replaced by the controlled, frightened man who was in too deep to turn around. He put the letters in his coat pocket and walked out of her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the gray pre-dawn and thought for exactly 2 minutes. Then she got up, put on her riding clothes, and went to find John Merritt. He was already awake, which she had expected, because she was beginning to understand that he slept lightly and noticed things. The residue of years of moving through places where trust was scarce and attention was survival. He was in the barn with a lantern, and he took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. All of it, including the part where Clarence had almost wavered, because that was important too. Not just for her understanding of her brother, but because if there was going to be any way through this that preserved any remnant of her family, that moment of wavering needed to be remembered and worked with. John listened with that complete attention that she had come to value more than she could quite articulate. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Voss knows the injunction is coming," he said. "He's going to push Clarence to complete the transfer before it lands, probably today." "The document still needs a notary and a witness," she said. "Even a forged power of attorney needs those." "Voss brought his own notary," John said. "One of the men who came last week. I recognized him. He works out of Benson, and his professional ethics are for sale." She stared at him. "How do you know all of this?" He hesitated. The lantern light was amber and steady between them, and the desert beyond the barn walls was beginning to lighten toward gray. "Harlan Voss is not unknown to me," he said carefully. "In New Mexico, before I came here, I saw what his consortium did to a family named Aldridge in the Mesilla Valley. I was working their place when the trouble started. I couldn't stop it then." A pause. "I recognized his name when you described him. That's part of why I stayed." She absorbed this. It explained things, small things she had noticed, the way he had watched Voss's men with specific rather than general alertness. "You came here partly because of Voss." "I came here because there was work," he said. I stayed because of you. He said it quietly and without apparent embarrassment, the way he said everything, directly and without ornamentation. Then he seemed to register what he had said and looked at her steadily as though waiting to see what she would do with it. She felt the words land in the center of her chest like something warm and irreversible. She thought about all the practical things she should say in response. She thought about the fact that her brother was in a room somewhere on this ranch with Harlan Voss and a corrupt notary and a forged document. She thought about her father in his sickbed. She thought about 3 days becoming 2 days becoming this morning. She said, "We need to get that document before it's signed." "Yes," he said. And then, almost as though he could not quite help it, he reached out and briefly touched her hand where it rested on the stall gate between them, just his fingers over hers for a moment, and then he let go. "We'll deal with this. Then we'll deal with everything else." She understood that by everything else he meant the thing that was growing between them, the thing neither of them had named yet because the timing was genuinely catastrophic. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she agreed completely with that order of operations. They had a plan by the time the sun was fully up. The plan was simple because simple plans had fewer points of failure. They needed to reach the sheriff in Tucson, not the local man who was useless, but the county sheriff, who was theoretically independent of Voss's local connections. They also needed to stall whatever Voss was orchestrating long enough for the injunction to arrive, which was expected that afternoon or the next morning. John would ride to Dusty Creek and wire the county sheriff's office in Tucson. It would be faster than riding there, and the telegraph line was still working. Susan would stay at the ranch and manage whatever happened with Clarence and Voss directly, which she was better positioned to do because it was her family and her land. The flaw in the plan was the 2 men who were watching the ranch gate. John identified a secondary route through the eastern pasture that came out 1.5 miles from the main road and could be reached without going past the gate watchers. He knew about it because he had been riding the fence line every morning and had mapped the property the way a cautious man maps every place he might need to leave quickly. He saddled Calico quietly while Susan went back to the house. What happened next was not what either of them had planned. As Susan crossed the yard toward the ranch house, one of Voss's men stepped out from behind the water trough where he had apparently been waiting. He was a big man with a quiet face and a professional manner that was more frightening than aggression would have been. "Miss Shelton," he said politely, "Mr. Voss would like you to join the meeting in the parlor." It was not a request. She could see it in the way he positioned himself, between her and the house door, which was also between her and the route to the barn where John was. She went. The parlor had been rearranged. The writing table was in the center of the room, and seated around it were Clarence, Harlan Voss, and a man with a notary seal case who looked at her without expression. Voss was perhaps 50, well-fed and expensively dressed in the way that men from the Eastern financial interests dressed when they came west, as though frontier discomfort were a personal affront. He had gray hair and the comfortable manner of someone who had never personally experienced the consequences of his decisions. "Miss Shelton," Voss said, "please sit down." "I prefer to stand," she said. "As you like." He folded his hands on the table. "Your brother tells me you've been in contact with territorial legal authorities." "My brother is correct," she said. Voss looked at her with mild, calibrated interest, the look of a man who was used to women behaving unpredictably and had developed a response for it. "An injunction takes time to be confirmed. Legal processes move slowly, as I'm sure you understand. The transfer of property, on the other hand, can be completed this morning." He gestured at the document on the table. "Your brother has the authority delegated by your father." "My brother has a document that a territorial judge is currently examining for evidence of forgery," she said. Clarence looked at the table. Voss smiled slightly. "An allegation is not a finding," he said, "and until a judge formally rules, the document stands." "Then sign it," she said. Sign it and file it and see what the judge does with it. She was buying time. John needed time to reach the telegraph office. Every minute she could keep Voss talking was another minute. Voss seemed to understand this because he stopped smiling. He nodded to the man at the door who left the room, and she heard, a moment later, the sound of someone being brought across the yard. They brought in John Merritt. He had not made it to the secondary route. He had been watched, which meant the men at the gate were not the only watchers. He came in through the parlor door with the professional calm he always wore, but his jaw was set in a way that told her he was angrier than he was showing, and there was a scratch along his left cheekbone that had not been there an hour ago. "This is the man who helped you," Voss said, studying John with the assessing look of someone cataloging a problem. "The itinerant ranch hand who used to study law. Interesting history for a fence mender." John met her eyes briefly. The look communicated several things simultaneously, including the fact that he had not made it to the telegraph office but that he was not particularly frightened, and also something else, something quieter and more private that she felt in her chest. "Mr. Voss," John said, with the same unhurried tone he used for everything, "you're not going to complete this transfer. The injunction lands today or tomorrow, and when it does, any completed transfer will be subject to clawback and criminal penalties. Your notary there is one forged document signature away from losing his license and possibly his freedom. And you personally are the subject of an investigation in New Mexico territory regarding the Aldridge property in the Mesilla Valley." He said this last part clearly and watched Voss's eyes sharpen. "You've been operating under the assumption that your legal exposure is contained. It isn't." Voss was quiet for a moment. "You know about Mesilla?" "I was there," John said simply. That was when Clarence stood up. Susan watched her brother stand up from the table and understood, with a mixture of relief and grief, that the thing she had seen in him in her room that morning had not entirely vanished. He looked at Voss, and he looked at the notary, and he looked at the document on the table, and something in his face seemed to collapse inward under its own weight. "I can't sign it," Clarence said. Voss looked at him with the first genuine emotion Susan had seen on his face, which was a cold, focused fury. "You are not in a position to back out, Shelton." "The debts," Clarence said. He was talking to Susan now, not to Voss. "I owe him money I borrowed 2 years ago. He's been leveraging it ever since. The sale was supposed to clear it." "Clarence," she said. "Father built this," Clarence said, and his voice cracked. It was the first time she had seen him crack since they were children. "I know what I was doing. I knew the whole time." Voss reached inside his coat, and that was when the situation transformed from a business confrontation into something far more dangerous. He had a gun, a small, precisely kept revolver that he held in the practiced way of someone who had used it before. He pointed it at Clarence. "Sign the document," he said. John moved. Not toward Voss, because Voss had the gun on Clarence, but positioning himself between Susan and the door, between Susan and Voss's man who was somewhere behind her. He was calculating the room. She could see him doing it. Voss's man, the one from the doorway, came around behind John, and then the gun was at John's temple, and that was where this story began. Susan Shelton stood in the doorway of the parlor that had become a saloon in her memory's compression of crisis, and the gun was at John Merritt's temple, and her brother was staring at the table, and Harlan Voss was watching her with those calculating eyes. She was in love with John Merritt. She understood it completely in that moment, understood it the way you understand the landscape from a high ridge, all at once and in every direction. She said, "Clarence, look at me." Clarence looked at her. "You know what Father always said about the land," she said. "You told me once that you remembered it. He said the land is not worth what you can sell it for. It is worth what you would sacrifice to keep it." Something moved through her brother's face. "You have a chance right now to sacrifice something real," she said, "instead of sacrificing everything Father built." Voss said, "This is touching and irrelevant. Shelton, sign the document." Clarence Shelton reached across the table, picked up the document, and tore it in half. The room went very still. Then Clarence reached into his coat, and Susan's heart seized, and he produced not a weapon but a folded letter. He set it on the torn halves of the document. "That is a full accounting of every transaction between myself and Harlan Voss going back to 1880, he said, "including amounts paid, coercions made, and witnesses to the financial arrangement who are currently living in Benson and Mesilla." His voice was completely steady now, the Clarence who managed cattle drives, but pointed in an honest direction for the first time in years. "I prepared it this morning, before Voss arrived." He had been considering it since their conversation in her room. He had been preparing for it. Voss's man still had the gun at John's temple. John said, very quietly, "The county sheriff's wire is already sent." He had made it to the telegraph. He had made it there and back before they caught him, and the scratch on his cheek was from being pulled off calico on his return, not on his way out. Voss looked at the torn document. He looked at Clarence's accounting letter. He looked at John Merritt and the composed confidence of a man who was reporting a fact rather than making a threat. The mathematics of his situation rearranged themselves visibly on his face, the calculation of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was trying to determine whether violence would help or hurt. He decided it would hurt. He said, "Put it down," to his man, and the gun left John's temple and the room exhaled. It took the county sheriff 3 hours to arrive with 2 deputies. Harlan Voss and his men were detained in the parlor with what Clarence, unexpectedly, turned out to be quite good at managing, which was the controlled, reasonable authority of a Shelton on Shelton land. Voss was a man who operated through leverage and legal machinery and hired menace. He was not, Susan assessed, a man who was willing to personally escalate past a certain point, and that point had been passed. When the sheriff arrived, Clarence gave his accounting letter and his testimony. It was clear and detailed and incriminating of Voss in ways that went far beyond the Shelton ranch. The Mesilla Valley situation that John had referenced became part of the record. The notary, facing the choice between professional destruction and cooperation, cooperated. Voss was taken to Tucson in custody. His men followed. The injunction was confirmed by telegraph that same afternoon. The ranch was safe. Susan was in the garden when she heard the last of the horses leave the yard and the silence settle back over the property. She stood very still in the dusty heat among her father's roses, which grew at the south side of the house, and which Elias Shelton watered himself every morning, his one agricultural vanity, and she felt the 4 months of sustained, grinding fear dissolve out of her body like something physical, like sand washing out of fabric. She heard footsteps on the path behind her and knew them without turning around. John stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the hot afternoon air. He had washed the blood from the scratch on his cheek, and his hat was off for once, and he looked at the roses with an expression that was simply peace, the expression of a man in whom something had also settled. "Your brother," he said. "I know," she said. "He could have burned it all, and he didn't." "He almost did," she said. "He made terrible choices, and he knew it." "What happens to him now?" She had been thinking about this. "He'll cooperate fully with the territorial authorities against Voss, which will reduce his own culpability. He'll likely face some penalty. He won't go to prison, I think, if he's honest and the judge sees him as a witness more than a perpetrator." She paused. "I don't know if I can forgive him." "You don't have to decide that today," John said. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her in the direct, unhurried way he had, and she thought about 6 weeks of learning the shape of this man, the way he stood and the way he thought and the way he had stayed when anyone with less integrity or less reason would have left. "You said you stayed because of me," she said. "I did say that," he agreed. "I thought about that," she said. "Quite a lot." During the intervening crisis, something shifted in his expression, the careful neutrality giving way to something warmer and a little more unguarded. "Is that right?" "It seemed relevant," she said. "Given that I have also stayed," she added, which was not quite what she meant, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, which was its own kind of statement. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face, his fingers just grazing her cheek. And then he left his hand there, cupped gently against her jaw, and she turned her face slightly into it because she was 25 years old and she had been strong and contained and practical for so many months that the simple warmth of being touched by someone who cared what happened to her was almost more than she could hold. "Susan," he said, which was just her name, but in his voice it meant something much larger. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to a question but felt like one. He kissed her in the garden beside her father's roses. In the late afternoon of the day the ranch was saved, and it was gentle and careful and completely certain, the way he did everything. And she held onto the front of his shirt with both hands because the world had just become much simpler than it had been for a very long time, and she was not entirely sure how to be in a simple world. They told Elias Shelton that evening. Susan went to her father's room first, alone, and she told him everything. The forged document, the consortium, Clarence's debt, the months of managing it, the injunction, all of it. She sat on the edge of his bed and held his thin hand and watched his face move through shock and grief and then, slowly, something like release. "Clarence," he said, not angrily, just the name weighted with 30 years of fatherhood. "He chose right at the end," she said. "He didn't have to. He could have signed the document and let Voss take everything and been in Mexico by morning. He didn't." Her father was quiet for a while, his eyes on the window where the desert evening was going deep blue and beginning to fill with stars. "You managed all of this," he said. "Not alone," she said. "The young man," her father said. He had noticed John in the way that Elias Shelton noticed everything slowly and completely. "Merritt." "Yes." Her father looked at her. He had known her for 25 years and he read her face the way he read the land, with the attention of long familiarity. He did not ask a question. He simply nodded once, and Susan felt something that she had not felt in months, which was her father's uncomplicated approval. She brought John in after that. He sat across from Elias Shelton's sickbed with the same ease he brought to every situation, neither performing respect nor deflecting from it, just being present and honest. He answered Elias' questions directly, including the questions about his background and his family and the unfinished law degree and the years of movement. He did not apologize for any of it, which Susan had expected but which seemed to satisfy Elias at a level that any polished performance would not have. "You kept my daughter safe," Elias said. "She kept herself safe," John said. "I just knew where the courthouse was." Elias Shelton made a sound that was the closest he had come to genuine laughter in months, and reached out and gripped John's hand briefly, the grip of a man who was running out of strength but not out of intention. That night, sitting on the porch while the desert cooled around them and the stars spread themselves extravagantly across the Arizona sky, Susan and John talked until midnight. They talked about everything that had been set aside during 6 weeks of crisis, the things that required peace and time to say. He told her more about his father and the case that had broken their family. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12, and about learning to run a household and manage accounts and ride fence lines at an age when girls back east were learning watercolors. They talked about what the ranch would look like going forward, now that the threat was removed, and what would happen when Elias was gone, and what came after grief in the particular way grief worked when it had been anticipated for months. And he asked her, somewhere around midnight, with the desert silence absolute and the porch boards warm under their feet and the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, whether she would consider letting him stay. Not as a hired hand. Not in the provisional, ready-to-move-on way he had been everywhere else. He meant permanently, in a way that would need a different name than ranch hand or ally or even the unnamed thing they had been to each other for the past weeks. She sat with the question for a long moment. 25 years old in 1882 in the Arizona Territory. She had been managing her family's land and her family's crisis and her family's survival, and she was good at it, and she did not intend to stop. She was not looking for someone to rescue her, and he was not offering to rescue her, which was part of why she trusted the offer. Staying permanently, she said, would require certain formalities. "I'm aware," he said, "Are you proposing formalities, John Merritt?" "I'm proposing whatever you want to call it that ends with me not leaving," he said, with the closest thing to nerves she had ever heard in his voice, which was gratifying in its honesty. She looked at him in the starlight, this man who had ridden in on a quarter horse named Calico and stayed because of her, who had known where the courthouse was and what the law could do, and when to be silent and when to move, who had kissed her in the garden like a man who had no intention of ever kissing anyone else, and she said, "Then don't leave." It was not, technically, the most formal acceptance in the history of proposals. But it was completely clear, which was, she had come to understand, the language John Merritt used and valued above all others. Autumn came to the Arizona territory with the particular mercy of seasons in the desert, the brutal heat of summer giving way to mornings that were almost cool and evenings that required a jacket and skies so clear and blue they seemed painted rather than real. The Shelton Ranch entered that season in a state of cautious recovery, the kind that follows crisis and requires time to trust. Clarence had spent 2 weeks in Tucson cooperating with the territorial authorities and had returned to the ranch in early September with a letter from the territorial prosecutor indicating that his cooperation had been noted and his legal exposure was significantly reduced, though not eliminated. He would pay a substantial fine. He would be required to make a full accounting of all his dealings with Voss. He would not go to prison, which was what Susan had hoped for and what the evidence seemed to support, since Voss and his network were the primary targets of the prosecution. His return to the ranch was difficult. Susan did not pretend otherwise to herself or to him. Trust was not a thing that could be rebuilt in a single afternoon conversation, and she was not a woman who performed forgiveness she did not feel. But she sat with him on the porch on his first evening back, and she told him what their father had said, that he had chosen right at the end, and she watched the words land in the place where Clarence kept things that mattered. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I know," she said. "That's probably the first genuinely honest thing you've said to me in 2 years." He accepted that. He was different in small ways, quieter, less polished. The controlled surface that had always worried her was still there, but underneath it she could occasionally see something real moving, which was new. John, characteristically, treated Clarence's return with exactly the same practical straightforwardness he brought to everything. He did not crowd the man or perform warmth he did not feel, but he also did not punish him or hold him at deliberate distance. They worked side by side when the work required it and kept a polite, functional distance when it did not, which was the most sustainable arrangement anyone could have managed. Elias Shelton's condition worsened through September, as the doctor had said it would. Susan managed his care with the same attention she brought to everything, and John was with her in ways that did not require description to be understood. He was there in the early mornings when she came in from checking on her father and needed 5 minutes of silence with someone who understood. He was there in the evenings when the weight of impending loss pressed down and required either distraction or company, or sometimes both simultaneously. He never tried to fix what could not be fixed. He simply stayed, which was the thing she had asked of him, and which turned out to be the most sustaining gift she had ever been given. In October, on a Thursday morning when the desert was still, and the light was golden, and the roses at the south side of the house were putting out their last stubborn blooms of the season, Elias Shelton died. He died in his sleep, which was the mercy the doctor had said to hope for, and Susan was with him, and it was peaceful in the way that death sometimes is when it is anticipated, and the people around it have had time to prepare, which does not make it less than devastating but makes it a different kind of devastation. She cried, alone in her father's room, for a long time. And then she washed her face and went out into the yard where the ranch still needed managing, and the horses still needed water and the world still required her attention. John was in the yard. He had known, she thought, the moment she came through the door. He crossed the yard and took her in his arms without saying anything, and she pressed her face against his chest and let the grief move through her in the way that grief does when it is not being managed, and he held her until it passed into something she could carry. They buried Elias Shelton in the plot beside his wife, under a cottonwood tree at the north edge of the yard. The whole town came, or what the town was willing to offer, because Elias had been known and respected for 30 years. Even people who had not known him well knew that the Shelton Ranch was part of the landscape in a way that very few human things were. The ranch was hers now, legally and entirely. The will was straightforward, drafted long before Clarence's dealings with Voss, and Elias had left the land equally to his 2 children, which meant Susan and Clarence were co-owners, which was a situation that would require careful navigation going forward. But there was the injunction settlement which had cleared the title of any consortium claims, and there was Clarence's demonstrated willingness at the critical moment to choose the ranch over the money. Susan thought it could work. Not easily, but it could work. She and John were married in November in the church in Dusty Creek, which had acquired a circuit preacher who came through every 2 weeks. The wedding was small. Pete Garza stood with John. Mrs. Hargrove from Tucson stood with Susan. Clarence was there, quiet and contained in his best suit, and he shook John's hand after the ceremony with genuine warmth, which Susan filed away as evidence of progress. Susan wore her mother's dress, altered to fit by the seamstress in Dusty Creek who did the best she could with a 30-year-old garment, and it fit well enough and felt like a continuation of something rather than a beginning, which seemed right. John wore his cleanest clothes and his good boots and looked at her when she came through the church door with an expression that she knew she would remember every day of her life. The preacher was brief and practical, which was the only kind of ceremony that fit the Arizona territory in 1882. The vows were the traditional ones, and when John said them, his voice was steady and absolutely sincere. And when Susan said them, she felt the words settle into her like something permanent. Afterward, on the church steps, with the November desert cold and clear, and the mountains visible in every direction, she stood in her mother's dress and held her husband's hand and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, that the future was something she could look at without dread. The winter that followed was the best winter of Susan Shelton Merritt's life, which she recognized even while it was happening, which was a rare gift. The ranch work continued, as it always did, because cattle and horses and land do not pause for personal happiness, but the work was better with a partner who understood it and cared about it. She and John managed the ranch together with the same natural efficiency they had brought to navigating the legal crisis the previous summer, each understanding the other's strengths and respecting them. Clarence threw himself into the ranch work with a focus that she had not seen in him for years, the energy that had previously gone into managing his double life now directed at the land itself. He was a good cattleman when that was all he was trying to be. She watched him slowly become that, and slowly began to trust him again, not completely, but genuinely. The letters from the territorial prosecutor arrived periodically through the winter, updating the case against Harlan Voss, which was substantial and progressing. Voss faced charges in both Arizona and New Mexico territory. The Aldridge family in Mesilla was part of the prosecution, and John wrote to them, carefully composed letters, keeping them informed about the progress of the case. He did not describe this as making amends for not having been able to stop what happened to them, but that was what it was. In December, Susan wrote to the judge's representative in Tucson, formally thanking him for his handling of the injunction. She wrote it carefully and at some length, because she believed in acknowledging the specific ways in which people had helped, and he had helped enormously. She received a reply in January that mentioned, in passing, that the representative had relayed a message to the Territorial Bar Association regarding one John Merritt's abandonment of his legal studies, and that the Bar Association had indicated an interest in discussing a path toward examination an admission for a candidate with his evident knowledge and experience. She showed John the letter at breakfast, watching his face as he read it. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "You wrote to them," he said. "I thank the judge's representative," she said. "I may have included certain relevant information about your background and abilities." He looked at her. She met his gaze with complete composure. "Susan," he said, "your father would have wanted you to finish," she said quietly. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the winter desert was spare and silver blue under a January sky, and the ranch was quiet in the way that the coldest mornings made it quiet. His face moved through several things, and she watched all of them without looking away, because this was important and she was not going to manage it by looking at anything else. "I'll write back," he said finally. "I'll write back to them." She nodded and returned to her coffee and said nothing more about it, because there was nothing more that needed saying. Spring came in March, as it always did, with wildflowers across the desert floor and the cattle restless and the work expanding to fill every available hour. Susan was managing the accounts when she noticed, in a way that at first she attributed to the busy season and the changed routines of a first winter of marriage, that something was different. By the end of March she was certain. She told John on an evening when the porch was warm enough to sit on again and the stars were coming out and Calico was moving peacefully in the corral below and everything was quiet. She simply said it plainly, the way she did things. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and she saw something pass across his face that was not like anything she had seen there before, not the calm or the caution or the careful assessment. It was open and unguarded and almost painful in its completeness. "A baby," he said. "In September, I think," she said. He reached for her hand and held it without speaking for a while. The stars spread above them and the desert was warm and fragrant with the spring it had been waiting months to unfold. "Your father would have been pleased," he said. "Yes," she said. "He would have been." She leaned her head against John's shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat like that while the evening deepened around them, two people who had come to each other through crisis and more crisis, and had emerged somehow here. The summer of 1883 was cooler than the summer before, which the ranch hands said was a good sign for the water table. The cattle did well. The accounts were healthy, the first year in several that they had been genuinely healthy rather than managing a deficit. Clarence had proven himself through the winter and spring in ways that mattered, arriving early and leaving late, and making no financial decisions without Susan's knowledge and agreement, which was a new arrangement they had settled on in February and which was working. John received a letter from the Territorial Bar Association in June, outlining the examination process for candidates seeking admission based on prior study and demonstrated knowledge. The examination would be held in Tucson in August. He studied in the evenings after the ranch work was done, going through the texts and statutes with the focused attention of a man who had never actually forgotten any of it, just set it aside. Susan sat with him sometimes while he studied, doing the ranch accounts or sewing or reading, the lamp between them and the desert night outside the window. He passed the examination in August, which the examiner noted was one of the stronger performances he had seen. The letter arrived 2 weeks later and Susan read it twice before she went to find him. He was in the barn, which was where she had told him everything 6 weeks after his arrival, in the amber lantern light with the horses shifting in their stalls. She handed him the letter and he read it and went very still. She waited. He looked up from the letter and his face was everything she had hoped to see. "John Merritt, attorney at law," she said. "It sounds right." He crossed the barn and kissed her the way he had kissed her in the garden, completely and without reservation, and she put her hands on his face and kissed him back with equal certainty. The letter was still in his hand, and she was 7 months along, and the barn smelled of hay and horses, and it was one of the best moments of her life. He did not leave the ranch to practice law. There was enough need for legal counsel in the area around Dusty Creek that he could do meaningful work without relocating to Tucson, writing letters and reviewing documents, and occasionally representing clients in Benson or the county seat. The ranch remained the center of things. He was John Merritt of the Shelton Ranch, which was what he had chosen to be, and he was completely content with that choice. Their son was born in September of 1883, on a night when the desert was cooling into autumn and the stars were particularly bright. He was healthy and loud and had, Susan noted with amusement, his father's dark hair and his grandfather's stubborn jaw. They named him Elias John Merritt, for the man who had taught Susan that land was not worth what you could sell it for. Clarence sat in the parlor when Susan brought the baby out in the morning, and the look on his brother's face when he held the child for the first time was something she had not expected, something unguarded and genuinely moved, and she thought again about the man her brother had almost entirely become in the 6 months since their father died, the man who was choosing, every day, to be better than the choices he had made when he was afraid. She did not absolve him of those choices. She simply made space for the choices he was making now. By the winter of 1883, the legal case against Harlan Voss had resulted in a conviction in New Mexico Territory on charges related to the Aldridge property, and a second case in Arizona Territory was scheduled for the following spring. John provided a written affidavit for the Arizona case, detailing what he had witnessed in the Mesilla Valley and the connection to the operation at Dusty Creek. The territorial prosecutor wrote to thank him and noted that his testimony would likely be significant. The Aldridge family wrote as well, a letter from the eldest daughter, who was managing what remained of their property. She wrote that the legal process was slow and imperfect, but that it was something, and that it mattered that people had come forward. John read the letter several times, and Susan watched him read it and understood that there was some healing in it. The wound that had been made when a 23-year-old man who believed in rules had seen the rules used to destroy his father, being addressed not by undoing the past, but by using what he knew to prevent someone else's future from being similarly consumed. Spring of 1884 arrived, and the second Voss conviction came down in May, and Harlan Voss was sentenced to prison in the Arizona Territory in addition to his New Mexico sentence, which was not justice in any complete sense because the Aldridge family was not fully made whole, and the Shelton Ranch had come far too close to being lost, and Elias Shelton had died with 4 months of fear that his children's choices had placed on top of his illness. But it was accountability, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, the thing that John had said he missed about law, the idea that the rules applied to everyone. They were applied. Imperfectly and slowly and with enormous effort on the part of everyone involved, but they were applied. Susan was expecting again by that spring, which she discovered in March, and which made John's expression do that open, unguarded thing again, the thing she loved most on his face. This second baby came in November, a girl this time, with Susan's coloring and her grandmother's name, which was Clara, and who arrived with less drama than her brother but with equal determination, and was immediately treated by young Elias as a subject of enormous interest. The ranch in those years became a good place, not without difficulty because ranches and families and human beings do not achieve lives without difficulty, but good in the essential sense. The land was productive. The cattle were healthy. The accounts were honest and carefully kept. Clarence managed more and more of the day-to-day operations as John's legal practice expanded, and the arrangement between them had evolved from enforced cooperation to something approaching genuine partnership. Clarence never married, which was something Susan occasionally thought about without resolution. He was 34 by the time Clara was born, and seemed to have made a deliberate peace with a solitary life, channeling what might have been domestic energy into the ranch and into a surprising involvement with the church in Dusty Creek, which he had begun attending regularly in the year after their father died. She did not ask him about it. It was his life, and he was living it honestly, which was all she had asked. The people of Dusty Creek knew the Merritts the way they knew anyone in a small territory town. with the specific intimacy of people who see each other through every season and every kind of weather. They knew that Susan Merritt ran the Shelton Ranch with her brother and ran it well, and that her husband was the lawyer who could be found at the ranch or in his small office in town, depending on the day, and that they had a little boy who was already riding a pony by the time he was 4 and a girl who her father was teaching the names of stars. They were known, which was the most grounded feeling in the world. In the summer of 1885, John received a letter from a law firm in Richmond, Virginia, the city where he had grown up. The letter was from a former colleague of his father's who had spent years attempting to reopen the case that had sent Jonathan Merritt to prison. The new evidence, gathered painstakingly over a decade, was sufficient. The case had been reviewed by a state commission. Jonathan Merritt was to be posthumously exonerated. John sat in the kitchen with the letter and did not speak for a very long time. Susan sat across the table and waited. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet in the particular way of a man who does not often let himself cry, where the fact of it was more meaningful for its rarity. He was innocent, John said, which was something he had always believed but which was different now, different in the way that the legal record was different from personal knowledge. The world now formally agreed. Yes, she said. He set the letter down. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "My father would have liked you." She felt that in the center of her chest, that specific warmth. "I imagine I would have liked him," she said. He reached across the table and she put her hands in his and they held on to each other across the kitchen table while the summer morning light came through the window and the sound of Elias playing in the yard came through the open door and the ranch moved around them in its familiar rhythms. He wrote back to Richmond that day, a letter of thanks and acknowledgement, and he wrote a separate letter to Jonathan Merritt's grave in the cemetery there, which he did not show anyone and which he burned in the kitchen stove afterward, which was his private business, and which she left completely alone. That summer they rode out together one evening to the eastern fence line, just the two of them, as they had on that first evening 6 weeks into his employment, when she had told him about the land and her father's philosophy. They sat on the horses in the fading copper light and looked out at the desert, which was the same desert it had always been, indifferent and beautiful and enduring. 3 years, she said. 3 years and 2 children, he said. And 1 exonerated father, she said. And 1 saved ranch, he said. And 1 attorney at law, she said. He smiled, which he did more often now than when she had first known him. It changed his face completely, that smile, opened it up into something that she thought was the truest version of him, the man under the careful, composed exterior, the man who had been 23 and heartbroken and had spent 5 years protecting himself by moving and was now here, stopped and safe and known. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking that I rode into this territory looking for work," he said, "and found everything I didn't know to look for." She looked at him in the copper and rose light of the Arizona desert evening, this man who had known where the courthouse was, who had said we without hesitation, who had stayed. "I'm thinking the same thing," she said. Calico moved beneath him, restless with the evening energy of horses, and her own horse shifted beside it, and the stars were beginning to come out above the mountains in the east, faint at first and then brilliant, the way they always came out over the Arizona territory, as though they had been waiting all day for the darkness. She thought about her father watering his roses every morning. She thought about the porch where she and John had talked until midnight on the night the ranch was saved. She thought about a barn in July and a garden in October and a church in November and a kitchen table in June of 1885. She thought about 2 children asleep in the ranch house behind her and a brother who was becoming, day by day, the better version of himself, and a legal system that was imperfect and slow and worth fighting for anyway, and a man who had once studied law in Richmond, Virginia, and had spent 5 years running from his grief and had ended up, by the particular logic of the West, exactly where he needed to be. The last of the sun vanished behind the western ridgeline. The stars spread themselves across the enormous Arizona sky with their customary extravagance, uncountable and permanent and bright. John Merritt reached across the space between their horses and took his wife's hand, and she held it, and they stayed like that for a while, looking at the land that was theirs and the sky that was everyone's and the future that was, at last, simply open and good. Then she squeezed his hand once, and he squeezed back, and they turned their horses toward home.